Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the TransCelerate webinar on Quality Risk Management Framework, Best Practices for Implementation of Risk Management in Clinical Development. My name is Gloria McHugh, and I'll be your webinar host today. And I am having trouble sharing my screen. And I'm wondering if one of the other hosts, if you guys have an ability to give me presentation rights. Oh, here, wait a minute. I think I can take it. Here we go. I got it. Sorry about that.
Okay. Yep. I can see it.
Okay. Now I'm sharing, right? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, great. Sorry about that, everyone. Give everyone a chance to get settled in. So again, welcome to the TransCelerate webinar, Quality Risk Management Framework, Best Practices for Implementation of Risk Management in Clinical Development. So I'll make some introductions before we get started with logistics and the content of today's webinar. The TransCelerate team members that we have on the line today, Melissa Suprin is the head of Quality Risk Management at Pfizer. She's also the QMS initiative co-lead here at TransCelerate, and she was the lead author on the QMS risk management paper, which was published in January of this year. We also have Alan Chow. Alan is a senior manager of quality and compliance risk management at Amgen. Alan is also a core team member of the QMS initiative and also was an author on the risk management paper. Again, my name is Gloria McHugh. I'm the webinar operations lead and a project manager for TransCelerate. So for tonight's webinar, if you have any feedback or technical issues, you can send an email to events@transceleratebiopharmainc.com, and we'll try to get that resolved offline during the webinar. In terms of logistics for today's webinar, all participants will be muted for the call. You should be able to dial in using either your phone or a computer. And I would suggest that if you have audio issues and difficulty hearing, that you might want to log out and dial back in using another method. In many cases, that does resolve the audio issues. You can also reduce the control panel for a better view of the presentation by clicking on the orange and white arrow in the upper right corner, and that will slide that control panel over to the right. We'll be using the questions panel for you to submit questions to our presenters. So you would just type your question into the questions panel and click send. We'll also be using polling for tonight's webinar. This helps us make sure the session is interactive and facilitates sharing of useful information. All participation in the polls is completely voluntary and all responses are anonymous. Your answers will only be shared as a percentage of respondents. So we're going to go ahead and test out the polling function right now. So you should see a blue screen that has the poll question, what is your favorite color? So if you can go ahead and select one of the answers there, and that's great. It also proves that everyone can hear me okay, so it sounds like we're doing pretty well. And we're up to already 66% of the people on the phone have voted. So thank you so much, everyone. And I'm going to go ahead and close that now. And then I will share the results. So for all the polls that we do, we'll share the results with you so that you can see directly how everyone on the phone has voted. So it looks like 57% have blue as a favorite color. So thanks everyone for helping to test that out. So we also want to review some ground rules for TransCelerate. We want to make sure that the discussion is helpful and that we can answer as many of your questions as possible. So again, participation in the webinar is completely voluntary, and also using any TransCelerate assets or tools is voluntary. You don't have to identify what company you work for. And specific topics that we would ask you not to discuss would include vendors, sites, or CROs that you are using or not using, any issues you have with any vendors, sites, or CROs, your long-term development plans, nor anything related to costs. We also cannot answer questions about vendors, costs of using or implementing TransCelerate assets or tools, or which member companies are using the assets or tools. The agenda for today's webinar, I'll spend a few minutes going over an overview of TransCelerate and providing an overview of the QMS framework. And then Alan Chow will provide us with the risk management framework. He'll spend about 40 minutes going over that information. And then we'll take a pause and we'll do a Q&A session. And that's where you'll be submitting your questions in writing using that questions panel. And then we'll spend the last 20 minutes or so reviewing our risk library, as well as the risk management example. And then we have a few more minutes at the end with further Q&A and a couple of audience poll questions. Just so you're aware that the webinar is being recorded, and the recording and slides will be made available to all registered participants, and it will be posted on the TransCelerate website and available for anyone to access. So you will get that in another day or two. So with that, I'll move into an overview of TransCelerate and the QMS framework. So TransCelerate is a not-for-profit entity created to foster collaboration. Our shared vision is to improve the health of people around the world by accelerating and simplifying the research and development of innovative new therapies. TransCelerate was founded in 2012 with 10 member companies and 5 initiatives. We had a major milestone in 2016 when BioCelerate was founded as a subsidiary. BioCelerate's focus is on preclinical research. And today we're up to 20 member companies, with Regeneron being the most recent joiner. And we have more than 25 initiatives, including 5 pharmacovigilance initiatives as well. So really the breadth and depth of the solutions that TransCelerate is delivering is really helping to enhance industry collaboration and moving us toward the future vision of platform trials. Currently, we have more than 12 initiatives that are delivering solutions that really help facilitate platform trials of the future. And additionally, we also have a platform that enables data sharing, and that's called TransCelerate. The reach of our global membership is expanding. As I mentioned, we have 20 member companies at this time, and at any given time, there are over 1,000 people from those member companies that are participating in initiatives, helping to design, develop, and implement those initiatives in their member companies. Our presence and impact, as well as engagement, is worldwide. We have a network of 30 countries that, again, include member company representatives and employees that help to design and deliver the initiatives and implement them in their member companies. And we also engage on a regular basis with 13 global regulatory authorities to ensure that we have input from the regulatory authorities as we're designing and developing our solutions. And now I'll turn to the quality management system framework. So TransCelerate published a clinical quality management system framework back in 2016. The purpose of the framework was really to provide an integrated framework through which organizations can systematically define their quality objectives and link those to their broader strategic goals. Some additional purposes would be to help efficiently achieve an organization's quality and organizational objectives, to help reduce recurring quality-related issues that undermine patient safety and data integrity and also consume valuable resources, increasing the confidence in clinical research and its results, and as well as to integrate individual trial-level quality and risk management activities to provide a holistic view of whether clinical quality objectives are being met and risks to subjects and data quality are appropriately being addressed across the enterprise. I think that's an important part of the QMS framework, is that QMS is above the trial level. It's really at the enterprise level and would be affected by all the functions within clinical development. And I know that Alan will probably speak to some of that as he gets into the details of the risk management framework. So this diagram shows a visual of the framework that was published back in 2016. So you can see that we have elements of the framework that were reported to contribute to success in the clinical arena. So you can see that there are 7 blue horizontal bars. Those elements integrate quality into clinical development activities. And you can also see that there are 4 foundational aspects that are at the bottom of the diagram. Those foundational aspects are very key to being in place in order to successfully implement a QMS. The foundational aspects are to understand the context, leadership commitment to quality, organizational commitment to quality, and continual improvement of the framework. And lastly, you'll see over on the right, the 2 white bars are elements that provide ongoing monitoring of the achievement of quality objectives and the performance of the QMS. So you can see those. One is the assessing the CQMS. You really need to assess your CQMS to make sure it's working on a periodic basis. And also management review is a key part of the QMS. And TransCelerate's QMS framework is considered proactive, risk-based, and flexible enough for different types of organizations. As the team was developing the framework back in 2015 and 2016, of course, ICH E6R2 was also being revised as well. And so what we wanted to do is make sure that we have laid out the ICH E6R2 requirements in alignment with the QMS elements that TransCelerate has developed in their framework. So you can see on the left, the left column is the ICH E6R2 language specific to Section 5 and subsections within Section 5. And then you can see also that the CQMS elements that were displayed on the previous slide also align. Many of those align with the ICH E6R2 requirements. So the team was really able to align a lot of those requirements, and the tools that we've developed help describe how a sponsor can implement some of this to meet the ICH E6 requirements. Additionally, we have what we call tools that are available, and again, these are all available on the TransCelerate website. We have a very important tool called Assessing the CQMS, and this is a tool that lays out all of the elements and the foundational aspects and has survey questions for a sponsor to ask themselves about how their company is doing in this aspect of the QMS. So it's an important tool for assessing the overall QMS and helping you identify areas of improvement. We also have tools related to clinical knowledge management, as well as for implementing processes, and there are many other tools available on the website as well. So all of this is available for industry to help with the ICH E6R2 requirements. And so as we progressed, I just wanted to provide you with some additional detail on what is available to the industry in terms of the manuscripts and the tools that we've developed. These are all available on the TransCelerate website. So the conceptual paper or the framework, which described and defined all of the elements and functional areas, was made available in July of 2016, and supportive tools are also available since August of 2017. We also took a deeper dive into issues management. That was also published in July of 2016, and tools were available in 2017. And you can see that both of these initial papers have Chinese translations available on our website as well. We then also took a deeper dive into knowledge management, and again, that manuscript is available on the website since 2016, and additional supportive tools since 2017. As I mentioned, the Assessing the CQMS tool is a valuable tool for understanding how all of these different elements and functional aspects should work together in conjunction to help strengthen your QMS throughout R&D. And that's been available since 2017. Risk management, which of course is the focus of today's webinar. This is one of our newer manuscripts that has been available since January of this year. And we also have supportive tools available since March. And last but not least, we had a processes manuscript that was also published at the same time, and supportive tools in March as well. And we have also a webinar coming up in October that will cover the processes details. And many of our manuscripts are published on the DIA Tiers website. We have had more than 28,000 downloads made of those. And again, they're all available on the website at TransCelerateBiopharmainc.com. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Alan Chow, who's the Senior Manager of Quality and Compliance Risk Management at Amgen, to walk us through the risk management framework. And before Alan starts, I do want to just remind you that you should type your questions into the questions panel on your GoToWebinar control panel and click submit or send to send us your questions. Alan?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Yeah, but can you go to the next slide, please, Gloria? Yeah. Hi, everyone. This is Alan. So on the slide here, you can see this is the publication that Gloria mentioned, which was published in DIA Tears back in January of this year. I'm one of the co-authors on the paper, and that's going to be today's focus for me, as well as some of the tools that was also developed and also published based on this quality risk framework. Yep, next slide. We're going to be going through a couple polling questions to just get a sense of where we are as far as the audience. So please select here. The question is, how aware of the TransCelerate risk management manuscript and tool are you? So you can select between not aware, somewhere aware, or very aware. Go ahead and do that, and Gloria can show us the polling results when we get to a good percentage.
Yep.
Okay, we're at.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah. Oh, can you see that, Alan? I wasn't sure if you could see it.
Yeah, I can. It looks like we're around 80% already. So.
Yep. Great. Thanks, everyone, for quickly voting. So I'll go ahead and share the results then.
Yeah. So about 50% of you says you're somewhat aware. About 42% of you say not aware at all. So that's good. Hopefully I can share some light on this topic and kind of walk you through the paper as well as some tools. And then 8% say you're very aware. That's good. Okay, so let's go to the second polling question. So this polling question really talks about how mature do you consider risk management practices in your organization. So you can select between not mature, somewhat mature, or very mature. Let's see where our voting is. Okay, looks like most of you are saying somewhat mature. Again, we have around 80%.
All right. I'm going to close that, and I'll share the results.
Okay. Yeah, so it looks like the majority of you are saying somewhat mature, and 27% are saying not mature, and very mature being 72%. So good. I think we have a pretty good mix. So thank you for helping us going through that. So we have a basis. Now let's start with looking at the framework and the paper. So the first question I think many of you might be asking is, why is risk management clinical development important, or why do we kind of start on this journey and really looking at this topic? So it's clearly important to define and document quality risk management because it forms a foundation that we believe that when you manage your risk right through human subject protection and reliability of trial results in clinical development, those are the key focuses that we looked at when we were developing this manuscript. And also our framework that we laid out, we want to provide information and solutions to help you achieve the 3 goals that were listed here. So first of all, what is the most significant quality risk for your organization? To be able to answer that, right off the bat, we lay out some groundworks in the framework. The second is, to which risks should control be allocated? So not only, you need to identify your most significant quality risk, but, how would you apply risks to them? How would you apply control to them? And then lastly, talking about, is your controls effective? So when we're talking about controls, I just want to clarify, it could be really any action taken to mitigate risk. An example could be really implementing a new process, a new tool, or just writing a new SOP, because I think that's what we think about when we have controls. So those are the three major questions I just want to tackle. Next. Yeah. So this slide we thought was important because as we were working on this, there were multiple kind of misconceptions that we have. So these three are the most common ones. We just want to share with you before we go any farther. So the first one that I think many of us came up with was, well, QMS, is that the same thing as risk-based monitoring, or RBM? So that's the perception. The reality is, we want to differentiate the two, right? Because QMS is really talking about a holistic oversight that's across trials, programs, to also talk about a system level, processes, enterprise level, whereas RBM, is very much a component of the QMS. So, want to make sure, we don't kind of confuse the two. The second one I think is also important is, hey, risk management, is that the same as risk-based monitoring? It's all talking about risks. So yes and no. Risk management, in reality, constitute an element of the clinical QMS, as Gloria shared, as one of the elements. Whereas, RBM is an example of applying a risk-based approach, and it's very specific to trial monitoring activities, right? So, the difference you can think about is, risk-based monitoring is really applied, naming monitoring is applied normally at the end, whereas risk management is a more broader sense of, okay, how do we proactively assess risk to mitigate, issues, hopefully. So that's, the big difference. And also going to the third perception, as I mentioned, so issue management sometimes can be also confused with risk management. So the difference is really, as I already start mentioning a little bit, the risk management is proactive, whereas issue management is reactive, right? So issue is something that has already happened, whereas, risk management is being active, being proactive. And they are both, however, elements of the CQMS. So not to confuse the two, there is a difference. Next slide. So this picture was already shared a bit. I also want to emphasize, where exactly risk management is, as so it's an element of the clinical QMS conceptual framework, as you can see here. It's one of the 7 elements. What's important is, risk management should go across clinical development and not at a trial level. So that's one element I want to bring up right from the get-go. Also, I think up until recently, the focus of risk management has always been at a trial level, right? So we're talking about risk-based monitoring, for example, but the concept of risk management can be applied in a clinical development setting, as stated in our paper, and I think that's where our focus is when we were drafting the paper, and also with the light of ICH G6 R2, it talks about system or process level risk management, right? So this has received a lot of new attention, hence we based our paper on that. So if you look at ICH G6 R2, under risk identification section, it talks about risk should be considered at both system as well as a clinical trial level. So that's been our main focus. And other thing I want to bring out is the definition that we have for risk management. So it's a framework for preventing potential issues with the aim of avoiding unwanted outcome. So that's been the definition that we're working with. I think it's a key concept to keep in mind, because it brings up the point of, hey, it's not issue management, it's preventing potential issues. Okay, next slide. So this slide just reiterates again the definition of what is the risk management on the left, and then on the right it really shows again being one of the elements of the CQMS. The value proposition, however, I think is also really important when we are trying to talk about risk management, especially within our company. How do we really talk to our senior management and our peers to say, okay, what is really the value of risk management? So risk management, allows the organization to anticipate issues rather than just react to issues. So to me, that's a key, value, because when we're looking at issues, we're talking about kind of firefighting and putting Band-Aid on things that already happened. So that requires a lot of attention and resources. So what we're saying is, hey, if you do risk management right, you should be able to anticipate issues rather than, always be at the, end and trying to fix something that's already happened. It's also important to do risk management because it gives the leadership confidence that objectives will be met despite uncertainty. So to me, there is, in the environment that we're working in, it's very regulated, and there's constant changes, right? So, how does leadership have the confidence that we're doing things correct and we're being proactive? So risk management, can help us to do that. And lastly, also allows, obviously having a methodology, it's important so we can deploy resources where they will be most beneficial. So it's important because, all of us are, resource restrained. We need to be more focused with, where we kind of put our resources, whether that means, additional staff or just, time. So risk management helps us do that because once we identify where the high risk is, we can focus our resources on significant risk rather than, anywhere and everywhere. So, that's step one is, hey, where do we see where our significant risk is so we can focus our resources. Yep. Okay, next slide. So here, this slide really talks about some of the terms that was brought to the forefront when the conceptual paper was published. So, just because of the timing of the concept paper versus ICH E6R2, we thought it was important to show this slide so people don't get confused between different terminology. So, if you look at the component of a risk management process, these are the terms that were used in the concept paper. They're not the exact same terms as, was mentioned ICH E6R2. However, and then I'll go through the terms in the ICH E6R2 in the next slide. But, it is very much similar enough that, we're talking about the same kind of framework. Again, just because the timing and how things kind of came about, we adopted more of the ICH E6R2 term. So, for example, when we look at the first step here, talk about understanding the context, the ICH E6R2 term, the first step is critical processes and data identification. So it is very much similar. It's just being called something different. Okay, next slide. So let's spend some time on this slide. So because this is really again the steps and what we call the minimum requirements for quality risk management, and it's based on the ICH E6R2. Looking at the first step, critical processes identification. So it is key for organization to do that, and instead of again kind of boiling the ocean, where do we then focus our resources, and identify those critical processes, and then you have risk identification, which is once you have your critical processes, how do you identify where your risk lies? Risk evaluation is using a solid methodology of hey, let's try to not only identify risks, but then we need to score them. We need to have a method and kind of score according to its impact, its likelihood, and its detectability. Then you have risk control, and then I'll be going through some of the ways you can do risk control. But when we're looking at risk control, is hey, if you have risk that's above your threshold, how do we then tackle those and set up an action plan based on what your score is, and how do we then control those risks if you can control those risks. And then also important on the right, you have the 3 steps of risk communication, risk review, and risk reporting. So, the visual really talks about, having risk communication, risk review, and risk reporting all throughout your steps of your methodology. And then I'll be going through more detail of each of the steps. So, right, next slide. So before we talk about the actual steps, so we want to also make sure to emphasize the fact that, quality risk management, it's for a clinical development, there is really foundational elements to how to have an effective risk management in place. So these are the 4 key elements that we thought, it's critical before any of the steps can take place. So first of all, like anything, we need to have leadership commitment and oversight. So we need to have buy-in at the top level, making sure that, we are working at a cultural risk and, agreement at a senior leadership level. Obviously, we need to have a methodology for identifying, evaluating, and controlling of those risks, and I'll be going more through that in the later slides. Risk communication really talks about communicating a risk to relevant stakeholders, both at a system and trial level. So, how do we develop appropriate communication so everybody's aware that, what is being done and how risks are being mitigated. And lastly, but that's also very important is, how do we then periodic review of these effectiveness of the risk management program? So it's not a one-time risk assessment. We need to constantly revisit the risk management program because, first of all, we need to look at its effectiveness and also to come back and see if there's any new emerging risks that we can add to our risk program. Okay, next slide. All right, so let's go over what does it mean by leadership commitment and oversight. So, as I said, in order to successfully implement a clinical risk management program, there needs to be visibility, right? So, leadership commitment and oversight. So this can be achieved by some of the things that's listed here, but in general, we thought it's important that first of all, we need to align the risk management principles with your business objectives, right? So that's key. Also, we also need to ensure risk management is enabled in your organization, right? So we have a risk culture, and it's clear that risk-based decisions are being made. And also, I think equally important, it needs to be visible. So that's why communication planning is important. And leadership has bought in to providing resources for risk management. Just like anything, resource is key. So you need to have leadership buy-in, so there's resources available to do this work. Also, effective oversight of the risk management programs is important, meaning, this needs to be reviewed and, looked at on a continuous basis because, it's not just, you're putting a risk management program in place and then you never look at it again because that's not going to be effective. So you have to have appropriate oversight. Okay, next slide. All right, so now let's get into some of the steps that we talked about in the beginning. What are the minimum kind of requirements? So when we look at, first identifying risks starts with a conversation with regards to critical processes and data. So that's where we need to start. Whether or not you work at a small pharma, large pharma, we all have critical processes and data, right? So within the QMS, whether you have a business process management system or however you look at your process, that's where I would start to identify critical processes and data. And then as part of risk identification, we suggest a risk library can be set up. So we have this kind of example here of risk library structure, and then it's also one of the tools that we'll be talking about later on, that we can show you an example of, how and what a risk library might look like. It's important because then risks can be mapped to the relevant attributes in the library, as we kind of have the examples here. You have risk attributes, risk distribution owner, causes, and potential controls. Again, this is just an example, but it does bring some structure to how you can set up a risk library. And then also, what's important is looking at risk evaluation, right? So when we look at risk evaluation, all of us, I think, are familiar with, using impact, likelihood, and detection. There are a lot of tools and definitions that's readily available. But, in our paper, we thought, we use this example so people can see exactly, what the scale is and the definition that we came up with for impact, as well as likelihood and detection. So the way, it was the calculation, how it works, again, our example in our paper was, you simply multiply the three numbers. So, if you get a score of 10, 10, and 10, then, you just multiply the three numbers versus, some other score. So it's pretty straightforward, but, so it's important to show exactly what we mean by risk identification and evaluation. Okay, next slide. All right, so once you do the risk evaluation, how do we then do risk control, right? So when we talk about risk control, here we have methodologies for controlling risk. It's really comes down to three, methods, three ways of controlling risk. So you could either what we call risk avoidance, which really talks about removing the source of the risk. And as the kind of arrow suggests here, really talking about finding another way, to achieve the same objective without realizing the risk. Obviously, this is, if possible, right? So it's one of the methods that we're suggesting here that you can control your risk. The second way is, hey, let's do a risk reduction. Because it's a straightforward calculation, it's no-brainer that, if you can decrease the exposure of the risk, its likelihood of occurrence, or, you can decrease the impact of the risk, or detectability it's like a reverse, right? So if you can increase its detectability, you will actually lower the risk. So if there's ways that we can, do risk reduction, that's, another option. Risk acceptance is, at the end of the day, maybe we decide that this is the best we can do, and, choosing to not further control the risk and just accept the risk as it is, because, there's some risks that we know it's just, going to be there just because the nature of the process, right? The nature of the way we work. Obviously, there needs to be proper documentation and rationale to justify that, but a lot of times risk acceptance is also a way that we can look at to manage risk. All right, next slide. So documenting risk control. I don't want to go into too much detail on what's actually on the slide. Again, these are just examples of what we felt it's important when we document our risk control. But I think at the end of the day, what's important is, like anything, documenting the outcome of quality risk management in writing is important, because it helps ensure, first of all, agreement between parties. Then it helps capture outcomes, right? It's not just, hey, you say, I say, but, you're capturing that outcome by documenting. And also, it gives an opportunity for clarification. Because once you document something, once you have it in writing, it's black and white, it's clear. And then, then it gives people to kind of check and make sure that, nothing's kind of misunderstood. It also helps with communication, because, once you document your risk control, you can use that document in, different sources, and you can use it for communicating, whether internally, between stakeholders. Okay, next slide. All right, as I start talking about communication, so again, it's a key component, right? Communication risk. It's important to communicate to your relevant stakeholders, both at a system and a trial level. So, to me, communication not only increases the probability of a successful implementation of controls, it also supports it and encourages accountability and ownership of controls, right? So, when this exercise is not being done in a silo, right? It's not being done just by yourself. It is important that you have all the stakeholders together and everybody is aware and understand this process is taking place. And also, the frequency of communication needs to be identified, right? So it really depends on obviously your stakeholder group and how frequent these communication needs to go out. The format of communication, we kind of suggested that you can include risk quality performance metrics, and it could just be discussed between stakeholder groups. So it is important to share those information. All right, next slide. All right, going into periodic review of the effectiveness of risk management program. So as I already mentioned, this is not just a one-time exercise. Periodic review is also important in the whole risk management program. So we developed this kind of wheel of activities going from top down and then looping back, because when we think about kind of periodic review, we always have this vision of it's a periodic kind of cycle, right? So first you have your strategic alignment of quality risk management with business objectives, as I kind of mentioned. So you need to kind of start from there. Then we need to have an understanding of how do we then incorporate the quality risk management into the organization's processes, right? So talking about incorporating quality risk management in our day-to-day, starting with the process. Then the next step is risk-based decision making that's evident in communication and action. So how do we then translate that into action and communication, and those then can be shared. Once that's done, then resourcing for quality risk management can take place, because once we see, oh, this is really value added work, we need to put some resources on quality risk management. It is important to have the leadership buy-in and have appropriate resources put in. And then lastly, again, leadership oversight of the program meeting its requirements and its whether it's effective or not. And obviously this opportunity to make it more effective and update the program is also important. Okay, next slide. And I think, yeah, this slide really kind of goes back to the beginning of, hey, what was the conclusion, what is quality risk management in clinical development? So if we really boil it down to these four key activities, or important understanding identifying the most significant risk, that's step one, and then you evaluate and control the risk, as I mentioned, focus resources on controlling the risk, and then eventually it will lead to the prevention of issues. So that's our conclusion that's cited in our framework, and I think that's it. And then we're going to have a question and answer session. How are we doing on time, Gloria?
We are doing very good on time. We have about 15 minutes for the Q&A session, so we're right on track.
Okay.
Melissa, did you want to read out some of the questions?
Yeah, so maybe a good one to start with is, what do you recommend to start implementing a QMS? What's the first thing that you would do to build from the ground up?
Yeah. So That's a really good question. And can just go, if you look at, the minimum requirements that's already identified based on ICH E6R2, and again, we don't want to reinvent the wheel, but it really talks about, hey, you identify your critical processes and, and what they call data identification. So, the way I look at it, at least, how it's being done in Amgen, just want to maybe share something that's, more practical and use it as an example is, we have a very solid what we call business management system. So I'm talking about more of a risk management at a system level here, and we're strictly talking about process risk management. So once we have a good understanding of what our processes are, the first step that we did was we identified what are our critical processes. So we went through this exercise of kind of as a first filter, what are these processes that's going to affect our patient, our clinical trial results and data integrity, and then kind of having that first cut of hey, these are the key processes that we need to really focus and put our resources on before we even get to some of the next steps. So I think whether you work again at a large pharma, small pharma, to me that's really the critical first step to kind of get your quality risk management program off the ground. Is to look at it from that angle, and obviously the other steps as I mentioned is also important, but I think a lot of people do struggle with, well, where do we start? How can we just kind of get it going? Yeah. Do you have anything to add, Melissa?
Yeah, Alan, thanks. I think that was a great answer. I think it's, keep it fit for purpose to the application that you have, depending on the size of your company, the type of portfolio, the thing you're trying to do a risk assessment on. So I think we touched on that. And then Gloria also touched on earlier the availability of the CQMS tool to assess where you are in terms of implementation and maturity and where there might be opportunity areas. So that's another tool that's available as well if you're looking more broadly across your QMS. But I think one of the important things about starting somewhere is starting somewhere is better than starting nowhere, and trying to take a proactive approach, as long as, again, you keep it fit for purpose, I think is going to help. It would be hard to make it hurt unless you really overdo it. So I think it's one of those, don't be afraid to get started.
Right.
Okay. So there were some other questions, and one of them is around likelihood, impact, and detectability. And the question is, if there isn't enough data for direct evaluation of those factors, what do you do?
Ooh, that's a good question. So yeah, if you look at our risk evaluation section and the table that we laid out, right? So we try to give a definition of what we mean by impact, and then its likelihood and its detectability. So the impact, if you look at being high impact, is really hey, it's a direct or definitive negative impact on subjective right, safety, well-being, and or liability of trial results, whereas low impact is very low potential for a negative impact. So I guess when you look at a process, obviously you have to talk to the right stakeholders and and assess that. You get a score, and then the likelihood of that, which is also important, walking through the process of, hey, does it occur, and then if it occurs, what is its percentage, or how likely that occurs. And I know that a lot of people get confused between detectability, because it's kind of like a reverse mindset. Because I think I saw one question that just came in talking about why is detectability kind of reversed or different. So the way you have to think about it is if the process kind of goes through and it's failure mode, it can be detected every time, then the risk will be low, because you have proper monitoring or proper control in place that it can be detected. Whereas, if something was to happen, but you cannot even detect it, that's a high risk, right? So it's a little bit of reverse kind of thinking. And again, in our paper we talk about, hey, if you can detect it every time, then you get a score of 1, which is low, and then if you cannot detect that, it's high. I don't know if I answered that question, but that's basically the methodology that I know I work with.
Yeah, and Alan, I think just to add to that, there isn't always data to support the things that we use in risk assessments, right? Some of those assessments, the evaluations that we make, are based on the best information that we have at the time. And so you may not have data or metrics. You may have to rely on your subject matter experts to give you an assessment of what they think, absent that data, because it sometimes just isn't practical if you're dealing with trying to evaluate a lot of risk. You're not going to build metrics, and you may not even have time to build measures of the things that you'd be talking about. So often we have a combination of objective and subjective criteria that we're using to build that risk assessment.
Yeah, the discussion to me is key. So when you talk to the probably stakeholder, that's, to me, that's really the richness and and what the value. Like, and then you'll be surprised, because I know in my experience, as we talk through these risk assessments, more, you will actually discover more risks sometimes, just because as you walk through the process and talk it through, they're like, oh, wait a minute, I think we do have this other step that we didn't really think about, and I was like, oh, okay, well, let me add it to the risk library and register, and kind of then make sure that we look at that, because sometimes that only comes out when you're actually discussing the process and the risk. So yeah.
Good. So we do have a couple of other questions. We'll try to get them in before we run out of time on this section. But one is, what's the difference between risk management and risk-based monitoring? Can you give an example?
Oh, okay. Yeah. We can go back to the I think the perception versus reality, but in general, risk management, again, to me, it's being proactive, right? So really looking at it from a proactive approach. Risk-based monitoring is, it's, to me, it's an example, right, of applying, a risk-based approach to, and again, this is very specific to trial monitoring. So, as we keep on saying, risk management is at a clinical development level. And to me, risk-based monitoring is more at the trial level, and also the sequence of risk-based monitoring is more of hey, maybe something has happened, you're trying to monitor, and risk management is more proactive. Did I get that right?
Yeah, I think that's a good distinction. That the difference between monitoring is always looking for things that have already happened, right? It already went wrong, and now we're trying to find it and fix it. And as a sponsor, have oversight and make sure we're managing trials appropriately. So it's one type of control that we can apply in a risk management plan, but there should be others, and we should be looking not only for things that have already happened, but at trying to prevent things that haven't happened yet. They can inform each other, right? So the things that you find in monitoring can inform the things that you need to look for in the future, and the things that might be systemic risks or trends or things like that. But risk-based monitoring is always, as Alan said, going to be applied at the trial level, and it's always going to be after the fact. It's going to be looking at things that have already happened and controlling them, but not in a proactive, preventative way.
Right. Good point.
All right. The next question is about what we call risk tolerance. And the question is, at what level do we say risks are acceptable? And can you provide some examples? So maybe not a specific example, but what would you do with that information? So if you decided that your risk was at an acceptable level, or you were going to accept the risk as is, what documentation would you provide to go with that?
Yeah, so as one of the tools that we'll be discussing later, we do have a good risk example, kind of going through the steps that's laid out in in the framework, so kind of hold off on that. But I think in general, it is important, to have a threshold and then to take action based on that, because the whole idea of risk-based being really a key buzzword is how do we be risk-based if we don't have a risk tolerance, right, or your threshold. So for different activities, I think, and also this varies based on company to company, is what is our what we call risk appetite, right, risk tolerance. But once you set that, what's key is hey, anything above that, then we need to document and then take action. And when we talk about risk controls, it is one of the three methods that we can do, and then obviously have to document the appropriate action or no action. Yeah, I think that's what I want to say. Anything you want to add?
No, I think you hit that one. You covered it pretty well. So I think it's really just documenting whatever you decide, right? Whether it's to accept the risk or not, and so that you understand whether or not you have agreement across the organization about what the risk tolerance is. And that's really a question that every organization has to answer for itself. It's going to be different from company to company. So making sure that you're clear in your documentation and communication of that, make sure that everyone's on the same page in terms of risk tolerance.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe we have time for one more, which is, who do you think is the process owner of quality risk management, policy or SOP, quality function, or others? I don't think there's a specific answer to that one, but Alan, maybe you want to give your perspective?
Yeah, so I think, that it'll vary, right, from company to company. It really depends on, obviously, the size, I would say, of your company. So some companies obviously have dedicated risk management group, whether that's in clinical clinical development or just general kind of risk management group as part of QMS. So for example, we do in my company in Amgen. But I think whether it's you have a dedicated group or you're wearing multiple hats, I think it's important to start thinking about, hey, this risk framework is it's important. It's a key element of clinical QMS, and it is something that it's being looked at and getting more emphasized, whether it's from a regulator perspective or just industry wide. So it is important to kind of identify that role within an organization. I think that's more important than kind of, hey, where does this person sit, or what's this person kind of reporting structure? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right, Alan. And I think there's no right, one right answer to this. I think the good thing about the question, the way it was asked, is that there is recognition that there should be somewhere someone who owns this aspect of your QMS, right? Whether that's part of an ongoing role or an independent role or what have you. I don't think it matters so much where it sits, but I do like that there's at least a recognition that some resourcing is required and some oversight is required.
Yeah.
So Gloria, I was just going to say, why don't we go back to our presentation, and we do have 10 more minutes at the end for additional Q&A. So Alan's going to review the risk library and risk example. So we'll let him go through that, and then we'll come back to Q&A.
Okay. Yep. Okay. So the risk library was one of the tools that we published, and we developed and we published. We thought it works very well with the paper as a tool, and we just want to give people more examples, and also kind of answer the question of, hey, I know risk library is being talked about. What is it? How do we kind of incorporate it if you don't have one already in your company? And even if you do have one, hopefully this kind of shed some light on what we felt was best practices and how to start one and kind of make it better. So right off the bat, to answer the question of what is a risk library, we believe, a good risk library supports, efficient execution of risk management activities, right? And as an organization, we should develop a risk library because, groups risk statements into management categories, first of all, and also it provides a framework and repository for consistent risk information to be captured. So, it's a way to document risk. It's a way to summarize and define those risks to which, the company, what area and their subject, and where they're being exposed. It also helps, to have this document, to have this library, because it facilitates discussion of risks and their definition, and it promotes, a common understanding of, what it is, and, improves your quality risk management program overall. I think it's, both internal and external information are important. So, for example, we have listed here, some internal information could be, hey, knowledge and process management activities. It could be, from audits, identify risks, issue management activities. So this is one of these things that, kind of integrating, issue management practices into your risk management practice, because, again, as I said, it's a feedback loop, right? So once you have issues, it can be kind of fed back into your risk library and say, oh, wait a minute, we're seeing this hot area here, hey, maybe we should look at it from a risk perspective, so we can prevent it from, kind of happening. Some of the external things we can look at could be coming from government and regulatory body, changing of its regulation, obviously, and then, from industry best practices and trending. So whether it's, coming from, if you have a regulatory intelligence group, kind of giving you that information, that's also important to kind of keep our kind of antennas out there and make sure we have a good understanding of what's going on in our exterior environment. The last bullet here is also very important, so I do want to emphasize that, a lot of people might have a misunderstanding of, well, risk library should be, should capture all risks. It's really not. It's so I say here, it's not a list of all risks ever identified. It's really, should include those risks with a broad applicability, or, what they call a systemic risk, right? So you'll always have those kind of one-off risks, that's kind of what we call outliers that just, happens, so, that's where we kind of have to have some discernment of, what does it mean by a systemic risk. So, if you look at, ICH E6R2, it really talks about, hey, systemic from a clinical trial, process, that's affecting multiple trials. So that's, for example, that's what we mean by broad or systemic versus, one of those kind of one-offs. If you do have a risk library, we believe, there are multiple benefits. So I talked about, helping to facilitate discussions of risks and their identification and mitigation. So it's, having that kind of documentation. It's a consistent approach, right? So you have the approach kind of developing the risk library, and then promotes a culture of risk awareness. So, it's a document that can be really used to not only facilitate a risk session, but to document. I think we have a polling question coming up. Next. Okay, polling question. Yes, polling question number 3. So this one really asks the question of, does your organization use a risk library or equivalent? So let's see. Okay. Some good answers here. Wow, it's a pretty even. It looks like a pretty even split. Okay. Yeah. Wow. It's like dead even almost. So, all right. So a third of you said yes, a third of you said no, and a third of you said I don't know. So, okay. Very good. So hopefully, the process then we'll be going through in the next slide with help you to to develop or maintain and develop a risk library if you don't have one already. And then obviously, if you don't know, hopefully this kind of sheds some light on this topic. And then even if you have one, you know, hopefully this kind of process will help you improve your risk library. So when we look at process for developing and maintaining a risk library, now we created this kind of 4-step process. So you identify your risk, then you create what we call a risk library. Then take the step of using the risk library, and then the last one is maintaining the risk library, and then it kind of goes around in circle because, like I mentioned, this risk exercise needs to happen periodically, and it's not just like a one-time exercise. Okay, let's go through the first step of identifying your risk. Next slide. So identifying your risk, I think it's key to understand that risks can be identified at any time. And as I just kind of mentioned in the previous slide, so it could be both internal, external, and a lot of times, it's just through discussions that that you have with the appropriate stakeholders. As you talk to them, a lot of the conversations will lead to risks that just by discussing with the right stakeholders. So we listed some of the opportunities to consider for new risks. I don't want to read through all of them, but again, kind of taking the mindset of, hey, it could happen anytime, and also both internal and external considerations needs to be put in place. Because risk management, it's an integral part of the clinical QMS. The responses to any of the below CQMS elements, I think it's a key area where we can identify some of the risks. So we talk about, hey, inspection experience, talking about when we assess in the QMS, process management. So all of that areas can help us to identify your risk as a starting point before we kind of go into creating the risk library. Okay, next. So this step talks about creating the risk library. So it is important to have some kind of a structure. So when we create the risk library, and we'll show an example, in the following slide, but looking at how do we structure them into manageable kind of categories and framework, so people can really understand what it is. Should be built around, first of all, relevant risk attributes and be fit. So we call it be fit for purpose. So we don't want to a whole laundry list of risks, and nobody likes to go through that. So fit for purpose, again, it's key. You don't want to be too granular, with your risk, but at the same time, you want to identify those kind of key risks, and then, having the risk attributes right there. It's also helpful to differentiate risk into useful groups. So one of the suggestions we said was, hey, maybe look at different elements of the QMS and then categorize them that way. So if you have a risk associated to partnering, that should be probably classified there. If you have a risk associated to process, that's another kind of grouping. So when we look at it, we can kind of digest it much easier. A hierarchical structure, it's probably helpful to have, and then also talking about taxonomy of the risk. Again, just a way to structure it. Again, I want to read through, but I think also what's important is when you create a risk library, the description of the risk and the relevant information is key, right, to help you identify and evaluate and review those risks. So as you have risks, we always have known causes, and we then associate controls to those causes. Normally it's a one-to-one relationship. You could have obviously multiple controls to one cause, but it's normally the association is you have your causes and then you have your controls. And also for documentation purpose, it's also important to have a risk owner for each identified risk. Next slide. So use of the risk library, right? So you create the risk library. How do we then use them? So these 3 steps, again, it's part of part of the kind of what we just went over. So you do a risk evaluation, you do risk control, and then you do risk review and identification. So it's basically just applying. Once you have the library, basically just applying these steps and going through these steps. And I think risk review and identification is really important because it's not a static library, right? So when you talk about risk library, it's definitely not a static thing because you have to constantly kind of look at it and see, if first of all, is there any new risk that you could add to the library? Because again, the dynamic environment that we work with, is there any new risks that we can add? And also to periodically check if risks remain with their current controls. So maybe there is, some new controls now that we are made aware of that can better used to mitigate. And then also, if there's significant changes to your risk profile, you need to also be aware of that. So anytime, if there's a change in process, changing of, it can drastically change what we call the risk profile. Hence, you need to really look at it and make sure your current controls, if any, are still in place and makes sense. Okay, next slide. So the last step here, talking about maintaining the risk library. So what's key is, first of all, you need to have a process, right? That should be identified to maintain the risk library. So, I think some of the kind of maintaining, you have to identify, how often you review the risk library. So, you just have to kind of set a time period, whether it's, quarterly, twice a year, or annually. What is important is you need to have agreement and a process to do that. Because, it's key because risks and definition obviously can change over time. Some known risks should be considered, that whether it's, applicable across all elements of the QMS or it could be just, isolated to one. And obviously it can be, issue because it needs to, we need to react to event-driven triggers, right? Changes in organization, again, changes in your process. So all of that kind of needs to be taken into place when you are maintaining the risk library to just make sure that it's up to date, it's still fit for purpose, and it has the information you need in that. Okay, next slide. So I think the next couple of slides are just examples that we have in the to show what a risk library could look like. Again, these are just examples. These are no means by true events that have taken place, but we just thought it kind of brings out really the hierarchy and the structure that we talked about already. So if you look at this first slide, these are risks that we thought pertaining to partnering. So you have the risks under the partnering kind of heading, and then you have causes that's associated to these risks. So you can have multiple causes associated to the risk, and then you have controls associated to those causes. So it always kind of goes into that format of, hey, what's your risk, what's your cause, and then your control. Next slide. And then these are just 3 risks that we thought, it's important, or it could, could be what we consider risk, looking at a process as part of the QMS element. And again, these are just examples, and you can see that, some risks obviously have more causes than others. So the one that specifically talks about storage requirement not met for IP here is actually going to be focused on our risk management example. So we're going to actually use that and walk through as a risk management example using the steps that's mentioned in our paper. So that's going to be coming up. But it's one of the more serious risks that I think many of us face. So we thought, it was good to kind of walk through that example from kind of identification and then evaluating and then controlling and communication. So you're going to hear a little bit more about that in coming up slides. Next slide. Yeah, this slide is what we are calling the risk library taxonomy. Yeah, so the idea is, again, to just kind of have a visual of, how do we look at, risks and then, its associated causes. So as you can see, you can have risk, and then you can have causes, multiple causes associated to risk, and then you have controls, as we show, in the example, multiple controls related to causes. But then, those information will eventually be tagged into what we call the risk register, or the quality risk management plan. But that's not the only place where risk can come in. So there could be other risks that we go into the plan. So it's important to realize that risk could be coming from anywhere. So that's why we're saying the risk library is not really the place where all risks are captured. So it's really on the systemic risk, and it should be just part of what's going to the risk register. So it's just a good visual to help you visually understand that. Okay, that's it on the risk library. Next, we'll be going through the risk management example. As I mentioned, so this is the one example that we're gonna take through these steps that's mentioned. So the example that we're gonna cover is, risk that storage requirements may not be met for an investigational product. We're gonna be walking through these seven steps. Okay, next.
Alan, it's Gloria. I just wanted to let you know it is 9:17, so we have about 13 minutes left to get through these few slides and then some additional questions.
Okay. Yep, I was trying to be clear. I think we have like three more slides left.
Yeah.
Okay, so for this example of IP storage, the risk is pretty well understood. If IP lacks expected potency or contains impurity, then its impact is really twofold, right? So it has a potential to jeopardize human subject protection if it is still administered to subjects, and then obviously based on stability data, if temperature control is not well managed, it could also affect the reliability of trial results. It could be multiple causes because it could be looking at the process. IP shipment could be causes. It could be also storage requirement not met during storage at the depot, and then also storage requirement not met at the site. So these are just some of the causes that we thought is possible. Next. So assessment, going through risk evaluation, we're looking at impact, occurrence, and detection. So, again, these are just kind of made up numbers, but, impact, we thought, hey, it's equally important that, storage requirement, because it can have a huge effect on patient and trial results. So we said, okay, so let's score it all 10. And then, occurrence and detection, again, it's scored separately. And if you look at the risk score, we have 3 different scores. The threshold in this example we set is 160. So then just by looking at the example, both the storage requirement not met during CT shipment as well as storage requirement not met at site needs to have further risk controls. So this is where we then need to kind of have a documentation of, okay, how do we, do we accept, do we avoid, or do we reduce the risk because it has gone over our threshold. Next slide. so here, without reading through the whole slide, kind of talking about, hey, what is the risk communication plan? So obviously, we need to identify the correct stakeholders, and then you have to communicate via a communication plan. So we just have some suggestions of who needs who need to be made aware of this risk control requirements and expectations. Then we have to go through periodic review, right? So is it issue management for requirement not met? Are we looking at risk review for quality, for serious quality issues, or should occur at a predetermined time points, kind of looking at a periodic review, to set appropriate time periods to review that. And then lastly, answering questions and actions. So have we, effectively reduced the likelihood of occurrence? Is it something that we can, determine as far as action? How do we then decrease the risk of, IP storage? Next slide. And I believe this is the last slide, right? Yeah. Yeah, so the last step is kind of risk reporting. So I don't want to go too much detail into this, but this kind of talks about, your quality tolerance limits. So, we have a reference in our paper that says, there's a separate paper that really talks about quality tolerance limits. So, it's important, you have a summary of important deviations, have your quality tolerance limits, but deviation from predefined ones needs to be documented and then action taken on those. And also, just in our example, the risk report should contain the 3 risks identified in the risk evaluation, including scoring and justification that what's accepted and what controls needs to be kind of implemented and communicated. So everybody is aligned and understanding of hey, what is action being taken and who the risk owner is, and all of that needs to be communicated in what we call kind of risk reporting. Okay, I kind of breeze through that a little bit, Gloria. I think hopefully we still save some time for questioning at the end.
Yes, we just want to leave a minute or two at the end for our last 2 polling questions for the audience. But Melissa and Lychee, did you have additional questions?
There are a couple additional questions. So one is about the risk library. So if we go back to thinking about that topic, and it is, what are some of the biggest pitfalls with creating and using a risk library?
Okay. So, I mean, to me, at least from my experience, we don't want to be kind of extensive, right? We don't want to, again, have, every risk under the sun, because, then it'll be just like a laundry list of, every risk that has ever kind of, surfaced. So I think there is, a discernment that's important, when we do this exercise, having kind of the human factor into it and discerning, what is really, broadly, important, what is the systemic risk here, instead of just, listing everything. So to me, that's normally been my kind of issue, kind of having that discernment, making sure, what's in the library is, again, kind of fit for purpose. It's key. It's everybody would kind of agree to that as, being a risk. Yeah. Is that good? What do you think, Melissa? Anything? Yeah?
Yeah, I think it's just making sure that you're not letting the risk library be the default answer to what are my risks when you're conducting a risk assessment, right? It should be a tool that you're using to help trigger some thoughts about, oh yeah, we need to consider that, but not the only answer and not the only thing that you're thinking about. So making sure that whatever team is working on the risk assessment is using it as a tool and not as the only answer.
Right. It's definitely not a replacement for, again, just discussion and, interaction, because, I think those are still key where, when we talk about risk. So. Right.
Okay, maybe one more question?
One more? Yes.
Yeah. So, this one's about the relationship between issue management and risk management, and how do you see those fitting into the QMS together?
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, right off the bat, I think, there's obviously a big difference, right, between risk management and issue management. So, we mentioned risk management is, being proactive, and then issue management is more reactive. However, there is definitely a kind of a relationship in the sense of, hey, when you see a hot topic, hence, when you see a lot of issues popping up in certain areas, it should really, trigger, your thought of, hey, should we go ahead and take a look at it and make sure that, our risk library has that information, because, it is a hot area. But, I think the issue is we should not let issue management dictate, our risk management kind of practices, right? Because, normally what happens is, as an organization, you have issue management, that's way more mature than risk management because, we always go on and try to, firefight and fix issues, and nobody really, pay too much attention to risk management. So that shouldn't be the case, right? So I think that's where the kind of difference is.
Yeah, I agree, Alan. They're related. They're certainly not the same thing, but they're opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of risk management trying to live proactively, and issue management is trying to put in the right corrective and preventative actions so you don't have that as a risk going forward. But neither of those is 100% effective, right? We know that risk management is an imperfect process. You're trying to predict what's going to happen next, and we can't always do that precisely. So there will be issues, and we should learn from those issues about the effectiveness of controls that we've put in place and whether or not we need to make changes to our risk management approach. And similarly, if we were putting corrective and preventative actions in place in response to an issue, that may not mean that the preventative actions are 100% effective. There may still be some residual risk, or there may be things that we need to look at that are trends across issues that would come up to the system level from a risk assessment perspective.
Yeah.
Good. So some good questions today. And Gloria, I will turn it back over to you for the last couple of polling questions.
Okay. Thank you. So yeah, we have two last polls for our audience today before we drop the line. So if you could answer this poll, let me just launch this. So this one is, will the materials presented here today be helpful to you in your organization's risk management activities? And again, just a reminder that the recording and the materials will be made available. I'll send an email out with the links, and they'll be posted on the TransCelerate website as well.
Great. Okay, looks like we're getting good response rate, almost 70%. Yep. Okay.
All right, thanks everyone. I'll go ahead and close that, and we'll share that.
Okay. Yeah, so good. The majority of you says definitely yes. Say a third of you said probably yes, and 5% not sure. Okay, very good.
All right.
Do we have
and
one
then
more?
The last, yes, we have one more.
Okay, so the last question talks about how much value did this webinar provide, so overall. Getting 60%, getting there, almost 70%.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I'll go ahead and close that and share that. So thank you so much, everyone, for your attention today. Hopefully you were able to learn something. And again, all of our materials are available on the TransCelerate website, which will include the link to that when we send out the recording and the materials links. So thank you again for your attention, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gloria. Thanks, Alan.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.